Good evening. My name is Stavros Vasilakis, and on behalf of all of us at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, I want to welcome you for joining us tonight. I want to thank our co-panelists, Deputy Minister of Contemporary Culture, Nikos Yatromanolakis, Mayor of Kalithea, thank you for joining us, George Agouridis, a member of our board, and I want to welcome Henry Timms and the Lincoln Center team to Athens, and thank you for coming here, and thank you for the wonderful collaboration with our colleagues at the SNFCC. I had the opportunity to attend some of the proceedings over the last couple of days, and the work that is taking place is extraordinary and is going to benefit both organizations. We go way back in our grant-making history with Lincoln Center. There is a great relationship and a great collaboration, but we are especially proud about the work that has taken place over the last couple of years. Under the initiative of our co-president, Andreas Drakopoulos, a couple of summers ago, we started the SNF Lincoln Center Agora Initiative, which we consider one of our greatest collaborations and most important ones, in the sense that public spaces and the activation of public spaces is something that is really important to us and played a primary role when we started thinking about the building of the SNFCC. And Renzo Piano did a tremendous job in imagining the place as an active public space. So that initiative took place towards the end of the pandemic, or towards when things started to become easier, and gave an opportunity to New Yorkers to reimagine their lives and reimagine what it means to be outside together with other people. Now we are undertaking another initiative that we consider extremely important, is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Lincoln Center West Initiative. And it's a landmark initiative, that's how I consider it. I know Lincoln Center very well. I have lived around the neighborhood for a very long time. And it is a fact that it looks east, but it has neglected for many, many years its west side. So the project attempts to engage the west side of the campus and engage with a community that has felt neglected over a very long period of time. There has been a lot of bitter history about the building of Lincoln Center and ignoring the community. So I think this is really, really important. And we are very proud of the opportunity to collaborate with Lincoln Center in undertaking this particular initiative. In closing, again, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I want to ask and turn the mic to Eli Andriopoulou to say the next words. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you at the SNFC and online, and I wish I could be there at the Lighthouse with you tonight, but unfortunately the circumstances do not allow me to do so. Henry Timms and his executive team have been with us all week, and we are really grateful to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for the opportunity to strengthen our partnership with the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in the context of the SNF Lincoln Center Agora Initiative. Throughout this week, our two organizations have had the opportunity to exchange ideas, know-how, and experiences. And what we discovered is that despite our obvious differences in scale, in history, and in structure, we share common values and goals, and we are facing quite similar challenges. Our collaboration with the Lincoln Center in terms of programming kicked off last summer with the exhibition Faces of the Hero, when works by students of the Athens School of Fine Arts and the Parsons School of Design in New York were presented in the public spaces of the two institutions with free admission. Earlier today, we had the opportunity to discuss new areas of collaboration between our two organizations, and we're looking forward to announcing our plans very soon. So it is my pleasure and honor tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Henry Timms, to come to the podium. Henry Timms is the president and CEO of Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. He's the creator of the largest global philanthropic movement in history, Giving Tuesday, which has generated over $7 billion in donations for good causes. He's also co-author of the international best-selling book, New Power, How Power Works in Our Hyper-Connected World and How to Make It Work for You. and former President and Chief Executive Officer of the 92nd Street Y. Henry serves the Harvard Kennedy School as a Hauser Leader and is a Senior Fellow at both the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford University and the United Nations Foundation. Henry, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. If we go back to the beginning of the pandemic, when this all began in our lives, something happened that was truly miraculous. And the miracle, the unexpected miracle, was the vaccine. Remember back those times everyone said there was going to be no vaccine, it would take 6 years, it couldn't be done, it wouldn't work, it was going to be too slow, we'd have to find a way without a vaccine. And the great miracle was, thanks to experts, thanks to great institutions, thanks to science, thanks to data, thanks to reason, for all those reasons, we got the vaccine. We got the miracle that was prayed for. But something unexpected happened on the negative side too, and that was vaccine hesitancy. People simply weren't going to take the vaccine. People talked to their friends, and their friends weren't going to take the vaccine. There was online content that said the vaccine was going to damage you. And we saw play out a story which speaks to my broader theme today, which is the way that power is working in the world is fundamentally changing. So think about the power of the medical professions. They had all the reason, they had all the evidence, they had all the science, they had great institutions with big profiles, they had white papers, they had research. And yet, they ended up being out-communicated by the anti-vaxxers and the vaccine hesitants. Groups of people all around the world who came together not with any expertise, not with any big institution, not with any meaningful data, but came together and managed to get to a point where, although we got the miracle of the vaccines, we ended up blunting that instrument because a different kind of power was exercised. That idea is at the heart of the work I've been doing outside Lincoln Center, outside the arts, with my colleague Jeremy Hymans, which is to make a simple but important argument. And the argument is this. The argument is, in a world where we are all hyper-connected in all of these new ways, with the technology that is now in all of our lives, there has emerged a new way of being powerful. There is a new way of being powerful. We know the old way of being powerful, right? We call that old power. That was a world where power was held by few. It was really about the great leaders. It kind of downloaded onto the world. It was very closed up. It was very command and control. And what's happening is we're seeing the emergence of this new power. And new power operates very differently. It's not about what you download. It's about what people upload. It's not about the great leaders. It's about peers coming together around ideas. It's open and it's not closed. It's made by many people, not just held by few. So think for a moment about my anti-vaxxers example. The anti-vaxxers really had no old power. There wasn't a general secretary. They didn't have chapters around the world. They didn't have, a rule book or membership dues. They had all this new power that they generated through thinking about how you are powerful differently. And this isn't just a story of things like anti-vaxxers. It's actually the story of our times. So if you think about the success of a Barack Obama, it's a new power story about how he mobilized a crowd unexpectedly to get into office. If you think about the story of Donald Trump, it's a new power story. It's this invisible army of people around him who unexpectedly got him into office. If you think about the great businesses of our time, Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, they are all built because they've worked out how to use this new power. If you think about the social movements that are transforming our world, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, they are all made in new power ways. Here's another way of thinking about the same dynamic. Who knows this game? Who has wasted hours of their life? All right, so this is the biggest game of the 20th century, Tetris. And Tetris worked like the old power world. It is a good metaphor for the old power world. It was a top-down game, right? Someone else set the rules. these blocks fell down on your head, and your only job was to make them fit into neat lines again and again until eventually you collapsed under the pressure. There are still institutions who behave in this way, right? That's the old power world, which is very different from the most popular game of the 21st century. Who knows this game? Minecraft. This is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center made in Minecraft. So if you don't know this game, the power dynamics are completely different. Minecraft, there are no rules. It is made by people collaboratively around the world who come together to decide what they want to build on their terms and not on yours. And the big shift of our time for institutions is this shift from a world where we expected the world to work like Tetris, and now the expectation is on all of us to operate more like Minecraft. This has led to these two mindsets. So the two mindsets we're seeing play out in the world now are this old power mindset and this new power mindset. So the old power mindset, you really cared about things like expertise, managerialism, long-term affiliation. That's the things that you cared about most. The new power world cares about very different things. It cares about collaboration. It cares about transparency. It cares about everyone having a role to play. And the great challenge for all leaders and all institutions is how do you manage your old power and how do you manage your new power? I want to say one last thing before I move on to what this means for the cultural world. My argument today is not that new power is good and old power is bad. Right? My anti-vax story is a great example of how negative new power can be. But my argument today for the arts world, in fact for any world, is if you want to succeed in the decade ahead, you need to understand how to use old power and you need to understand how to use new power. So, here's my argument for the arts. My argument for the arts today, in terms of cultural leadership, is we are going to need to use a new equation if we're going to succeed in the new power world. So, this is my equation for leadership in the new power world, and it has three important components. Number one, performance. Great performances, the highest standards, the greatest quality. Number two, purpose. What is it that the work stands for? What is it that the work stands against? And most importantly, number three, participation. How are you giving people bigger roles to play in your world? So I'm going to walk you through each part of this equation and then give you an example of how I think this is beginning to work. So we start with performance. I want to start by this because one of the interesting challenges to the arts world right now is you could argue, I'm not sure I will, but you could argue that today is the high point of the arts in history. Dangerous thing to say here in Greece. But the reason you would say that is because in terms of volume, we've never had more art than we do today. We've never had more painters, we've never had more writers, we've never had more poets. We have a volume of creation around the world which is truly an extraordinary thing. And I would argue that in that world of so much volume, quality is going to matter more than ever. Great organizations presenting the greatest art have a bigger opportunity now, not a smaller opportunity. But performance alone is not going to cut it. Again, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but here's the reality of our world, I think, that we all need to work out how we better demonstrate the purpose of what it is that we do. What is the purpose of all of this art? Why are we putting it all on? And again, this is not really a new idea. I want to take you back to 1967. This is my predecessor, the third president of Lincoln Center. I'm the 11th. This is William Schuman, the third president of Lincoln Center. And he says this at the height of the Cold War. He says this at a time there is a battle for ideas playing out in the world between democracy and the Soviet Union. That battle is playing out. And William Schuman says this in response to his view on the arts. My first principle is the arts are an antidote. They are an antidote to the push-button emptiness of a mechanized age. They are an armor against disillusionment, and they are an armor against the self-destructive nature of man. He could have written that this morning. That is not a new idea. So the arts have always, of course, had a deep social purpose, but more and more we have to fold that into our worlds. We're going to have to do that more often to grab the attention and to speak to the moment. So here are some examples. The New York Philharmonic, our orchestra at Lincoln Center, the New York Philharmonic 2 years ago did something called Project 19. It was the biggest ever female-only commission project. They commissioned 19 new commissions to mark the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Wonderful art, wonderful music. One of the pieces commissioned won a Pulitzer Prize for Tanya Leon, but they put that idea, they put those amazing performances in a broader social context with greater purpose. Number two, we commissioned last year, after the loss of the great leaders C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, we commissioned a piece called The Baptism, which was a beautiful film piece which spoke in tribute to those civil rights leaders and what was lost. And number three, which Stelios mentioned earlier, during the pandemic, we were so proud of our partnership with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center, where at the same time, in Athens and New York, we had these wonderful art installations about what it was to be a hero. So in all of our work, in everything that we do, it won't be good enough just to be Lincoln Center anymore. We need to work out how we demonstrate a greater social purpose, which leads me to the most important part of this equation. And the most important part of this equation is participation, right? All of these people who are expecting to do more in our worlds, expecting to have a greater role to play. How do we invite them into our world on their terms? How do we get them into our world on their terms? In the old power world, we invite people into our world on our terms. We told people what they were supposed to do. The big challenge now is how do you take advantage of all this need to participate? So I'll give you an example, and I here want to pay tribute to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and actually to the visionary leadership of Andreas and Stelios, of course, because we have 16 acres in the middle of New York. Nobody has 16 acres in the middle of New York. I know it's nothing compared to the 220 acres you have here, but for New York, it's a big deal. So we have 16 acres in New York, and what Stelios and Andreas challenged us to do is to think of this space as an agora. How would you reimagine this space to create a more public, a more civic, a more generous Lincoln Center? And that visionary thinking was ahead of its time because when COVID hit, we had to reimagine the public space. So the centerpiece of that work was this. This was a piece by the theater designer Mimi Lien. And what she did is she took this very clean and kind of empty plaza and she built this beautiful green, this public space, this agora at the heart of Lincoln Center, where anyone could come all day long to see what was going on, to hang out, to see a show, to connect, to give blood, to come and vote. It became this celebration outdoors of civic activity and cultural life. And the reason it did so well was because people came and they themselves became the artwork. The artist Mimi Lien, she calls this a social sculpture. The idea was people would come and they would all take pictures of themselves on the green. They would share that with their friends, and that in turn would bring new audiences to Lincoln Center. So we ended up, due to our partnership with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, at a time we were closed, we had 250,000 people come to Lincoln Center. 25% had never been to Lincoln Center before. 50% were people of color. 50% were under 45. Which is an important reminder that when we talk about participation, we shouldn't just deepen the participation of people who involve in our world, but how do we invite in those people we have not served well in the past? How do we allow them to participate in our world on their terms? Second example of this was from the beginning of COVID, where we in New York, along with many around the world, had the great challenge that people were losing loved ones and simply couldn't have funerals. Do you remember that time? They weren't able to have funerals. So what we did every week was we had a concert online with artists like Yo-Yo Ma, and we invited anyone working with faith groups across the city, any New Yorker who had lost somebody to submit a name, and then the names of all those who had been lost would then scroll across the screen in tribute as artists played every week. Very powerful example, I think, of the way in which greater participation and greater purpose can lead to more meaningful artwork. And where this is all going next, and this is my prediction, is somewhere like here. So this is me 2 weeks ago at an exhibition called Super Blue. And Super Blue is it's a visual arts exhibition where you yourself have become the artwork. It's hugely popular. You've also probably seen the Van Gogh exhibition around the world, which has been off the charts popular. And what's happening in moments like this with Super Blue is they're creating these artworks which you don't simply observe, you experience the artwork, you film the artwork, and you share the artwork. So this is the second piece I saw at Super Blue. You can see this is a room full of mirrors and music, and as you film, you are surrounded by images of yourself turning in on you. And it is the most mind-blowing and surreal experience because it challenges and breaks down that wall between who is the artist and who is the audience. And that wall is going to become particularly important as technology changes. So the next thing I'm going to say is going to have some of you rolling your eyes. I want to warn you now. But the metaverse is coming, right? The world in which we are living, some people are now predicting that by 2040, we'll be living half of our lives in a fully digital world. And anyone right now who is feeling skeptical about that, just think how much time you spend on Facebook already. Think about how much of your life you've already given over to a digital world. Think about how often, even in the last 18 minutes, you have thought about checking your phone because the pull of the digital world is competing so much with the analog world. So one of the big trends, I think, coming from a new power perspective is the immersive experience is just getting warmed up. The idea that the audience have a much more interesting role to play than simply observing is going to be a key trend as we think about the years ahead. Now, by way of conclusion, I want to give you an example of this equation, this equation playing out in the real world. And of course, this is on a topic which is on all of our minds. 10 days ago, I think, maybe 2 weeks, right at the start of the war in Ukraine, there was a violinist. And the violinist was playing Ukrainian folk song in a bomb shelter. And he was playing this piece between explosions. He had to record it more than once because there were explosions in the middle of it. And he played this Ukrainian folk song, and within 48 hours, he began to share this and the music with other violinists around the world. And within 48 hours, 94 different violinists from all around the world had submitted their own videos to play with him together as a statement of solidarity against the crisis in Ukraine. And it's important, I think, particularly here at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center, in a city that represents democracy. And coming from New York City, which of course is a city that symbolizes liberty, it's so important that when we talk about agoras and open space and access, we recognize those people who right now are having their public spaces closed off and indeed destroyed. So as an example of, I think, the power of performance and indeed purpose and indeed participation, I wanted to share with you their performance, which was the statement they made in solidarity with the people of Ukraine.
So how to follow that? It's very hard. Kalispera, good evening. We're Sheila and Peter, and it's our huge pleasure to be here, a real pleasure, and to invite on stage to join Henry the rest of our brilliant panel, who between them occupy key elements of the cultural ecology. First of all, Nicola Yatromenolakis, Deputy Minister of Culture and Sport, responsible very interestingly in the Greek context for contemporary culture. And also in a conversation yesterday, Nicola told me it's his birthday today. So we promised that none of us would sing happy birthday. And then so we're here. But it's not something that many people do on their birthday to come to an event like this. So thank you especially to you for being here. Karomenia Genethia, I have murdered that Greek word. But I tried. Bravo, I'm sorry. And then, of course, you've already met Stelios Vasilikis, Co-Chief Programs and Strategic Initiatives Officer at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And of course, Ellie, who you already met, who's the chair, hello Ellie, the chair and managing director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center. So, bravo, Henry, for such an inspiring, provocative, radical ideas and propositions for action, and action soon. We need your words known far and wide and urgently. As you heard earlier, in addition to being CEO and president of the Lincoln Center and a very powerful speaker, Henry is also the author of, this is the book plug, this brilliant and best-selling book, New Power. And really seriously, if you haven't got the book, if you haven't read it, there's two different things, then make sure you do soon and really enjoy tucking into it. And a huge welcome to everybody here. Welcome to this conversation on new power and cultural leadership. We hope that it will be a lively, informal, surprising and motivating feast of listening and learning and thinking for us all. And we hope too that you'll leave this space, each of you, excited and inspired and determined to make deep and radical change, both for yourself and with others. And it's the with others, perhaps, is the really important thing this evening. This event is being live streamed, so welcome to everybody watching from wherever you are in the world. And it is also being recorded. Shortly, we'll turn to our wonderful panel of speakers, truly wonderful, of cultural leaders, conductors of light, your conductors of light over there, and determined change makers.
Thank you. Just very briefly, wanted to introduce ourselves and also to say thanks to Ellie, and I know how difficult it can be interacting in a space like this when you're on screen and you're not here in person. But for those of us who are here in person, it's just such a joy to be able to do that again after so long. Peter and I are genuinely honoured to be here in this conversation. We are both cultural change agents or superconductors. Thanks for the term, Henry, very useful. Working with networks of cultural makers on every continent over the last 10 years, apart from the cold bits at the top and the bottom of the world. So it may seem odd to you that you have not one but two moderators, co-moderators, but we hope in some ways this is a small demonstration of new power in practice. We'll share the work of this evening together and with you. So let's try to take some of the big ideas from Henry's proposition into context, practice, and action on the ground. So to kick off our conversation, we wanted to start by asking each of the panel, not you, Henry, but it's a reaction to your words. You are all three cultural leaders in the global and local cultural ecology at this critical moment of change. What's the one thing from Henry's powerful proposition that really excites you, inspires you, or puzzles you? as it applies to your everyday work. So what's the one big takeaway from that for you? So I think in the tradition of ladies first, Ellie, would you like to respond first for us?
Sure. Thank you, Sheila. I think the immediate thought that came to mind is, what is the role of cultural institutions in this changing context? And obviously we have the old power and the new power coexisting right now, and this has its benefits and it also has its challenges. I think one of the challenges of the new power is that because of this engagement of people, you also have polarization. So you have new power going in different directions, and this creates some polarization. And I think cultural institutions can play a really big role to bridge all the different participatory groups to create the space, both literally, like for example, we have a large, public space that can serve that role, but also through our programming and through arts, we can bring all these new powerful voices together to share that the new power that they have basically relinquished taken themselves.
Thank you. Stelio, what's your response? It should be on.
The thing that I found the most interesting and challenging in what Henry said is the idea of participation. And I'm looking at this from my side as someone who gets hundreds and hundreds of requests. As a foundation, we get hundreds and hundreds of requests from cultural organizations that participation and engaging groups that are in the margins has come to the center of their work. And it always wonders me whether or not this is done in a genuine way or this is a trend now. I see this continuously, and I have to question to what extent there are meaningful efforts and to what extent they're really impactful efforts. I remember a few years ago, we collaborated with the Brooklyn Public Library, the Queens Public Library, and the New York Public Library, the three major library systems in New York, to create what we called then the Culture Pass. And the idea behind the Culture Pass was to use the libraries, especially the libraries in marginalized communities, and provide passes for free to cultural institutions. And then we reached out to organizations that we have worked with and asked them to give up tickets for people to be able to use. And I was struck by the fact that the organizations that are the most willing to do so were the organizations, the cultural organizations that they were located within those marginalized communities. That the big and major institutions were very, very hesitant. And again, those were the institutions that came to us with the idea of engaging other communities, the idea of participation as a very major concept and important concept to them. So you have to wonder whether or not this is a trend, and you have to question many times, how can you do this in a way that is meaningful? And how do you give participation a meaning? Because if you're talking about participation for the sake of participation, it's vacuous, it's empty.
Absolutely, thank you. That question of the authenticity of the work is absolutely vital. Nicola, what's your...
First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to the SNF and to the SNFCC for hosting this event. So just to go to your question, I would focus on two different things from Henris's speech. One is about, first of all, I mean, I represent right now the state. So, and in Europe, that's a big difference from the US. The cultural sector is a sector where the state has a stronger role, and that has, you know, its pros and its cons. But I think that, first of all, that means that you have a big chunk of old power there. So, you know, how you deal with that and also how you change that is a question. And that takes me to Henris's equation. And I want to just touch upon the three components of that equation. So first of all, performance. And how, for example, I mean, the change in this mindset, in my opinion, is like when you talk about cultural governance, and for example, I supervise approximately like 20 cultural organizations around Greece, and then the entire, let's say, sector. So performance, do we value the quality, and is what, also like is what Henry was touching upon, but, or do we now assess the performance in a different, under a different standard? It has to do with other measures like, participation, I don't know, likes on Facebook or things like that. And are there pitfalls in that also? Because I think that there could be pitfalls. And then sometimes also there's this dilemma that you could have high quality events, so your performance is good in that respect, but participation, which was another measure or another component of the equation, is quite low. So you have all these things about high culture, low culture, and how you make, good culture, let's say, accessible to people is a key question here. And it changes our mandate also from just checking the points of, good cultural governance of organizations to improving access to culture across the country. And then, and I think this is where purpose enters. And again, there's a pitfall, and I want to mention it, which is if we only see culture as a means to an end, that could be quite tricky. So like a good piece of music, it's not worthy if it doesn't lead to, I don't know, a social cause or something like that. And this is a dangerous road that we should be quite mindful, if we're going down that road. But, so to see art as completely utilitarian, but at the same time, we are giving, and it's part of our strategy to give an additional, let's say, an added value to culture in addition to its intrinsic value. And if we have more time, I can be a bit more specific about these.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always that age-old debate between intrinsic and instrumental kind of value, and actually what we prioritize and how we work with that. Thank you for those initial responses.
Okay, well, back to Ellie and then to Henry. We salute your courage because you're setting out in leading two major globally facing cultural institutions on a very bold, radical journey, which is not going to be easy because from the beginning, as we know, there are many who will stand in your way. There'll also be apathy. And it is, to be frank, not easy, as we know, of people trying to make these changes to large organizations, including cultural ones, across the world. And very often it can lead to burnout and to exhaustion, and you're left with many bruises as you battle the old power, trying to tease it into this exciting new agenda. So the question is, briefly, how are you going to deal with such opposition or apathy? And how are you going to motivate your teams and boards to be with you, and indeed the people formerly known as the audience, the public, including, I hope, people here are going to be supportive. Hopefully that's why you're here, because you're interested in this necessary change. So yeah, how are you going to get through this and bring everybody with you? Ellie?
I don't think there will be opposition and apathy. I think, the premise of New Power is that people want to participate, and obviously that can change the way an organization works, like in its day-to-day sort of governance. But culture is by nature quite participatory, and I think you can have a good combination of some of the old power in certain circumstances. As Henry said, it's not good or bad, but also invite the artists more into the conversation, invite the audience more into the conversation, and have them, express their voice in the governance, in things that were traditionally considered internal, in programming, in visitor experience. I mean, it's been very typical in the past that you would do a customer satisfaction survey, and then, as the old power model, you would read the results and do a PowerPoint presentation and then interpret that in whatever way you thought and change some of the processes. Now it's a lot more responsive and reactive. We have that feedback real time, and it's more personal. So I think everyone's ready to embrace more participation, especially cultural institutions. So I don't expect a lot of opposition.
That's really good to hear, and good luck with that. Thank you, Ellie, and over to Henry.
It's interesting what Ellie just said about customer satisfaction. Even that framing is changing now, right? Which is whether our people are satisfied or not is actually not as important as are they passionate or not? Are they feeling they're committed to our cause? Are they believers in what we do? And actually, I think that's one of the big shifts here is we actually, there's a great opportunity in the intensity of what we do and building intensity around organizations that are, after all, critical to democracy. So I feel very positive actually about that direction. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about problems in general, in the sense that we try not to be defined by that, right? There's always an attractive narrative, which is everything's very tough and there's always problems and there's a risk here and a risk there and this could go wrong and that could go wrong. And you are capturing yourself if you embrace that narrative. And we at Lincoln Center have been bullish and we have been bold. We've always said, we're going over here, we're going to go there quick and we're going to go there in a very proud way. So I think that's really important. And I think most of all, we won't have opposition, we'll have drag. And it's different. No one's going to say, you're absolutely wrong, this is terrible, we should go back to the 18th century. Nobody is going to say that. What they're going to do is they're going to find clever ways of adding a bit of opposition to the side of what you're trying to do. They'll find ways of slowing you down, they'll find ways of questioning what you'll do. They'll start conversations about excellence. That will be code for excellence about conversations about not changing institutions. And so the thing we watch for actually is not opposition, but drag. And how do we build down the drag? And the reason we have made such progress as an institution, and look, we're just getting beginning, but if we can do another 3 years like the last 3 years, we will transform the institution. There are two reasons. One is we have the best team in the business at Lincoln Center, and I'm proud to have our executive team with me here tonight. And two, we have partners who push us to be bolder. So all of the project, the West project that Stelios mentioned earlier, came about because after we had done the Agora project last year, Andreas Trikopoulos didn't quite bang the table, but got pretty close and said, you guys need to speed up. Now is the time. You're making such progress. You need to build on that. And that was the biggest lesson I learned over the last couple of years, which is there is a return on boldness now that is something quite new.
Interesting. So loud, proud, and fast.
And power to your collective elbows. It's great to hear that optimism.
And your team. That interesting shift from kind of customers or consumers to sort of citizens that we're seeing and we're talking about in terms of the relationship with institutions, perhaps. Stelio, I'm interested, like you were talking about the kind of the authenticity of the kind of work and where, seeing that where it's actually located with communities. You have the privilege and responsibility of grant making all around the world, in Greece, but in many other places as well. And it's just a strategic overview of that. And wondered, could you say a little bit about where you think you're witnessing some of that, some of this work actually really manifesting itself from perhaps other locations, maybe in the global south, where you feel that authenticity is there?
Yes, I do think that it is a movement that is happening in many different places. And it is a movement because we are living in a global world, so people are constantly aware of what is happening around them. But again, I want to be cautious about this because it's not a really easy thing to do. Not at all. And again, the question is, how do you engage people and how do you bring them in? So if you look at the numbers, there have been numerous efforts over the last few years, and I will use the example of New York City, and I will use the example of other places that we have done work like this around the globe, where free tickets or cheaper tickets are offered to the audience. What the numbers would tell you is that the people who buy these tickets are the people who are already the customers of these institutions. So the question here is not a question of price. It's not a question of offering cheaper tickets. Of course, that comes into play as well. Your average, New Yorker cannot afford to go to the Metropolitan Opera. That is a fact. But at the same time, most of these communities, the communities that are staying away, they're not staying away because of prices. They're staying away because they're feeling that what is taking place within these institutions has nothing to do with them, that it's completely irrelevant, that even if things are often for free, the content and the space, it's not particularly friendly to them. So this is something that we have constantly be aware of. And I don't know the answer. This is really, really difficult to deal with, and this is really, really tricky. But again, the fact is that the people who consume culture worldwide remains today the same smaller group of people. One could argue that we are the same, what I would call culture vultures that travel around all the time and we're consuming culture. And that excludes the vast majority of citizenry around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sense of people making their own culture, what people define themselves as culture, which gets into another area.
I'd like to come back to you, Nicola, because you have responsibility for the health, the nurturing, the development of the creative ecology here in Greece, in contemporary culture, which is really important, in contemporary culture for the public good. And from our conversation yesterday, you're clearly passionate about it, determined to go faster. But it is a question about looking beyond the large metropolitan institutions. You also address culture across the Hellenic Republic. And how do you see the new power emerging beyond these large institutions and beyond the urban centers?
Again, it's about, first of all, defining what is your role. And in that case, in our case, it's what is the role of the state in this, in policy making in the cultural sector. So for me, first of all, it's about setting up the framework. You set up the ground rules. And that is something that the state is the one doing, or should do. And this cuts across a ton of topics, like from, for example, the employment of artists and the let's say even the labor and social security conditions of artists, to things like defining the ecosystem in terms of sponsorships or donations. Like, it cuts across the board, and it sets the tone, and it sets also kind of like the framework. But also, you have, as a state, to provide tools. And usually when we talk about tools, and also usually to build on what Stavros was saying earlier, when we talk about access to culture, we tend to focus on money. And also, even grassroots organizations that claim that they speak on behalf of people, but sometimes they speak on behalf of themselves and their small collectives, they say, just give us the money and we'll deal with the rest. We know what to do with it. Just do that and your work is done. But we have seen two things. One is, oftentimes, the people involved in the cultural community do not have the necessary skills in order to be effective. And I don't mean their art skills, I mean the peripheral, the soft skills, if you want, that are required to do your job effectively. That is one thing. And the other thing, that it's not just about money, both in terms of creating art and in terms of consuming art. There have been surveys in Europe and there have been surveys in Greece about cultural consumption, and they all say the same thing. Consumption in Greece is low. It's 1 out of 2 people is consuming art, in the question of, have you done something like gone to a museum, have you gone to a concert in the last 12 months? And this was pre-COVID. And it was like 1 out of 2. And then there was a follow-up question, and it was about, is it about money? No. Is it about the geography? Yes, sometimes, and I'll touch upon that. But the majority of people said, this doesn't concern me. This just fills me completely, it doesn't touch me in any form or shape. So engaging people, partnering with educational institutions, with schools, with things like, doing things like that, getting art to schools to start a conversation at an early stage about these things is part of the strategy. But also, as you said, this is a responsibility that has to do with the entire country. So financing, projects across Greece that begin a conversation, I think is very important. So, for example, we increased the money we give through grants to cultural organizations, private or grassroots organizations. In 2019, it was 3 million. Last year was 11.4 million euros, and we tried to disperse them.
Thank you. It's interesting. There was quite some time ago. I think it was in Connecticut, and I think it was Michael Wolff decided to turn around those kind of cultural surveys, and instead of asking people whether they participated in the culture that was being provided, they asked them what they considered their cultural activities to be, and just shifted the mentality and the kind of understanding of the question.
And that's been repeated around the world.
Yeah, it has, which is an interesting thought. I think we should open up to our audience for questions for a little while. We're intending to try and finish this session by 8:20 if we can, because some of the panel are attending a performance. So if you can keep your questions quite short, please, and feel free to ask your question in Greek if you prefer, then in English. We have simultaneous translation happening. So, and we'll probably take a few questions together. So I don't know if anybody wants to kick off. Otherwise, we can continue this discussion with our amazing, fascinating, interesting panel who could probably talk for days on these subjects.
Yes, we're cruel. We've got many questions lined up here.
Is there anybody who wants to raise a question? If not, we can continue with the questions that we have for our panel, which is very, very nice for us to work. Do you want to take a question, or do you want me to? Shall I?
I think.
In thinking about this, I was thinking it was actually something Henry said yesterday about being asked a question about the relationship with God and new power, which we're not going to get into. But my dad, who actually was a minister, always used to say that power is not like money. It's not zero sum. It's like love. The more of it you give away, the more of it you get back. But that requires a kind of bravery, which I think you've been talking about, all of you. And how do you, in those institutional positions where you're balancing old power and the openness to new power, how do you let go of control of some of your work to invite that mess and unpredictability of real participation that Stelios is talking about? What practical actions can you take to put your assets in that service of giving agency to other people to make the definitions and to create an exchange? So, Henry, I don't know if you want to respond to that first.
So I think even the framing of that kind of points a little bit to the issue, which is you're letting go of control, right? Which is not true with participation, right? The choice is not complete control or complete anarchy. That is not the choice organizations face. The great skill, I would argue, of the next 10 years is going to be how do you create the space, just to Stelios' point, for meaningful engagement, which is not no control. It's just a different way of framing the question, and it's a different way of engaging. So I'll give you an example. When we crowdsourced our memorial service, right, we didn't give up control. We had a very clear idea of working with clergy who would have deep connections with people of different backgrounds and different faiths. They worked very carefully with their audiences to make sure the names of people who had passed away were spelled correctly. There was all number of controls baked into that project, but the controls were baked around meaningful participation. So I think that's the way to think about this. And I also think one of the ways that anyone who is looking to undermine new power does it in two ways. They talk about risk and they talk about control. It's always a conversation about risk or control. And for me, the biggest risk for any institution right now is the seductive decline. That year after year, you don't change, it gets a little bit worse and no one really notices. Because we will embrace that and not take risks as organizations. So we actually, the bolder choice, I think, is actually to do nothing and watch yourself fall by the wayside. I don't think it's courageous to embrace this stuff. I'm just not sure there's another way of going. And to give you a very practical example of what this means, you have to have people on the team who embrace this kind of thinking, and you have to experiment. So we hired Shanta Thake, who's our new Chief Artistic Officer, who has made her career about creating deep and meaningful participations around the highest quality of art. And that's what's going to drive this forward, because it's not peripheral. All the things Stelios was talking about, lots of organizations do a little bit of this on the side. They do their kind of participation offset, right? So they do what they've always done, and they do a participation offset to prove that they're connected with the people. it's our core strategy now. It's what we're going to do at Lincoln Center. And if we do this really well for 5 years, we'll get good at it. So that's what we have to do next.
Yeah, otherwise you're kind of boiling frog syndrome. You're slowly, without realizing it, kind of dying.
You're
Ellie,
a dinosaur. Yeah.
Ellie, is it something you want to respond to at all?
Sure. I think it all goes back to purpose. Our purpose as a cultural institution can only be enhanced by giving agency to others. So I don't see it at all as a threat to control or as an added risk. I actually think that we will achieve our purpose faster and more meaningfully if we invite those that we are supposed to be serving into the conversation. I think it's actually quite harder to be guessing on people's behalf. So as long as you know what you're trying to do and you have a specific purpose, you can invite people in the conversation and ask them how you can better achieve that purpose.
Thank you. That makes complete sense.
Okay, I'm coming to you, Stelio, over there at the other end. And I'd like to ask you, as someone who has a kind of deep knowledge of history and philosophy, about how great ideas transfer over time and over continents. And you're very clear that history is not linear, and I think that's really interesting. Now, some of the audience will you now know that it's Nicola's birthday, but it's also St. Patrick's Day, celebrating the patron saint of Ireland. And my mum, my Irish mum, will be celebrating today without the millions and millions of people across the world who'll be drinking Guinness and too much of it. But you may not know that St. Patrick was not Irish. He was born in Wales, on the island of Britain, and trained in the priesthood in France before returning to Ireland as a missionary, and part of a Christian network of the exchange of ideas that stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean as far as Damascus and Syria. And this was the 5th century, which in Greek history is nothing. Currently, returning today, Stelio, the Agora Initiative is manifest in a predominantly transatlantic relationship, and that's very important, and we need to maintain those links. But the question is, how can the Agora expand to have a global reach and meaning, particularly in the context of the Global South, which is a whole different proposition? And if you do believe that this can be part of the Global South, our cousins, our family in the Global South, how would that happen?
So I mean, the Agora is a Greek term, but at the same time, it is manifesting itself everywhere. If you look into Jacobs, the great urbanist, the great American urbanist, she always believed that the greatest manifestation of a public space, a greater manifestation of Agora, is the street corner. That's where you see people arguing and disagreeing all the time. So I think there is a lot of uniqueness within the Greek paradigm of what Agora means, but we also have to think that this is something that is happening constantly everywhere. That is not something that we are creating here at the SNFCC or at Lincoln Center, but it is something that is taking place all the time. Public spaces are Agora spaces by definition, where there are folk festivals, where there are street corners, where there are sports games. These are all spaces where people get together, interact with each other.
But is it your aspiration as a team, we've been meeting over the last few days, to reach out and make new relationships in the Global South and other parts of the world? Or do you just think it's fine, it carries on elsewhere, and you feed each other?
Absolutely. And we do try to work with institutions to create the conditions that it can lead to that.
Yeah.
But I also want to say that, this is not done in a patronizing way, because we recognize, because it's easy to be patronizing. We're recognizing at the same time the uniqueness of different communities and the fact that they do create these spaces on their own, and they have been creating those for thousands of years.
Exactly. Exactly.
In
Thank you for bringing up Jane Jacobs as well. It's like that work is so powerful.
She's a hero.
When in the past.
I want to ask you, Nicola, you were saying yesterday that you've been looking at expanding the relationship between kind of culture and perhaps other kind of sectors or ecologies, and you've been thinking about the idea of cultural prescribing, perhaps as a response to the kind of deprivations or privations of the pandemic and what we know that means for mental health. Do you want to say a little bit about how you see that development too in the context of this idea of institutions and new power?
Again, it's about purpose, as we said before. So there are ways we're trying to engage our institutions, but also to support programs that do not stem from our own institution, but to fund things across Greece that engage in such things. So just to give you a few examples, one example is the one you touched upon, which is cultural prescription. Actually, we just signed, not just like a few months ago, we signed an MOU with the Greek Ministry of Healthcare, and we are together setting up a new model where actually healthcare professionals will be able to prescribe art as part of therapy, not, necessarily just about mental health, but even physical. And also, we already have programs that deal with issues like that. So, for example, Momus, which is a contemporary art museum in Thessaloniki, they are already working with oncology patients, and they do some quite important work in that field. So that's one example. Another example is, and it's quite topical, is again of like shifting purpose, is right now as we speak, there is the Thessaloniki Documentary Festival going on. And, we tend to focus on documentaries as things that maybe, focus on things that happened in the past. But things are becoming quite topical. So I'll give you two quick examples of what they've done. During the pandemic, they were about to launch their 2020 edition, and we had to cancel it or do it online, actually, just like a month before the actual festival. So we said, yes, we're going to do it. And also what we're going to do is we're going to give you some extra funding. And with this extra funding, you're going to commission documentaries about the pandemic that we're going to show during the pandemic. And that changed the discussion. And what they're doing during this edition is they shifted a bit their focus. So, for example, there are 2 or 3 quite important documentaries about what is happening in the Ukraine, what is happening in Russia, and also about the anti-establishment movement in Russia. So things like that give you a different kind of engagement and purpose, if you will, that you can do that. And the third thing is give the tools to, as we said, across Greece. So giving tools and funding to people that can actually engage people locally and talk about things that are important there, I think, is something quite important that changes a bit the narrative of what we've been doing. So again, getting projects across Greece or empowering people through culture. So we took craft from we now have we run a craft project. For us, it's also a tool to empower women, mostly outside of Greece, mostly in low-income communities and areas. Of course, there's a heritage part there, cultural heritage part there. There's our history there, but it's also a way to engage people, not just in art itself, but to actually provide an economic activity through culture in a place where there are no alternative business models or economical models. So we're dealing with things like that right now.
That's really useful, thank you. And yes, really important to think that participation is not just about participation in cultural work, but in all aspects of kind of life and economic.
And the creative economy at large.
Exactly, which is my background.
And also maybe these women who've been making things with their hands for a millennia are not recognized very often by cultural institutions. Like the definition could be between wet knowledge and dry knowledge. The dry knowledge is what we learn at school and university and so on. It's certain and so on. And the wet knowledge, so the indigenous knowledge, is something that we've yet to reach in terms of these cultural institutions. Returning to you quickly, very quickly, Ellie and Henry, it's so good to hear your confidence about moving ahead. But I wanted to ask, just for one example of something you're most proud about that demonstrates new power within the work you're doing in both of your cultural institutions? Just one small example, maybe. It's an impossible question, sorry.
It's a journey. So I don't think, we have nailed it by any standards. I think there are two ways we're going about it. Some are a lot more active. So right now, and more deliberate right now, we are working on creating a youth council. And we're going to be inviting people from 15 to 25 to participate in our programming, and also give them some money to suggest, programming that will be funded by us. And the reason we're doing that, as I said, it's all about the purpose. We're about welcoming everyone. And we recognize that we weren't able to easily get young people to come to the SNFCC for performances or other cultural activities. So we're just going to ask them, what do you want from us? What can we do for you? So that's a more active and direct way. Another way, and it goes back to what Nicola said earlier about people saying that culture doesn't concern me, is to put art and culture in their way. So not have people come for that specifically. Most of our visitors to the SNFC come just for a walk. And we create these these art exhibitions in the public space, and without them knowing, they come across this art and participate in this cultural experience that they hadn't even planned for. Just a few days ago, we announced our collaboration with the Neon organization, and together, because participation is also about collaboration, and we're collaborating with many institutions around Greece and the world, together we will be bringing the Maman of Louise Bourgeois. This is something that everyone will see, whether they're coming to the SNFC to see that and interact with this art, or whether they're just coming for a walk. They really can't miss it.
Yeah, those lovely unintended collisions of experiences and people. Thank you, Ellie. And Henry.
So in a week's time, we're going to announce our Festival of New York. And the Festival of New York is taking place this summer, and it's a New Power initiative. So the old way you thought about festivals, you curated it, you chose all the events, you decided who should be on what stages, and you downloaded it onto the world. Clive Chang here on my team is running the Festival of New York this year, which is a completely New Power festival. So we've reached out. It's not called Lincoln Center's Festival of New York. It's just called Festival of New York. We're one of the organizers of it. But we have now 200 organizations from all 5 boroughs, from blood banks to food banks to immigrant organizations to arts organizations to big businesses, who are all coming together collectively to essentially crowdsource a festival to celebrate the resilience and the diversity and the integrity of New York City at a time that we've had such a rough ride as a city. And I think I'm very proud of the boldness and the ambition of that initiative.
Thank you, Henry. Amazing. I think we all want to go now. So
you can join now. This is the good thing about New Power. Feel free. You're very welcome. We'd love to have you.
Right, that's it. It's a deal.
We're moving to the close now, so these are kind of final comments because of our time constraints. So, Stelio, you're a major funder with a strategic overview, as we said, of practice. What changes do you see in funding practice that respond to this agenda? So in terms of, we're seeing in the kind of movement funding moves towards participatory grant funds, unrestricted granting, and shifts in governance in funding terms. Can you say a little bit from your perspective about what that means?
So one of the things that permeates our grant making, whether it's the arts, whether it's education, whether it's health and or social welfare, is reaching out to organizations that do not have the opportunity or the ability to partake of what your average citizen is partaking of. And this is something that we have been looking for consistently. So that happens throughout our grant making. And this is something that we have been doing for quite a while, and this is something that we will continue to do. Again, it's not an easy thing to do. It's easy to give money away to organizations that they will say that they will create a participatory environment. But again, you have to be very careful, because to do so, it's not an easy thing to do. But this is something that we have done, and this is something that we will continue to do all the time. And again, it applies to all of our grant-making efforts, I would say. Engaging communities that they are traditionally marginalized for a variety of reasons and traditionally have not had the opportunity, again, to be part of the greater picture. So this is something that will continue to happen throughout our grant making.
Yeah. And then recognize it's long and patient work of real intelligence and integrity in those spaces. Nicola, for the last word from the panel, as a policy maker working with national government, how do you feel you can expand the space you have to build this kind of new power relationship, to work with Henry's equation?
We feel your pain as well, because being in a culture department within governments, from our experience, is always the tough one to be.
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, first of all, I think you have to kind of like lead by example. I mean, if you want people to behave in a certain way, you have to behave in that way yourself. So, for example, it was a very, very conscious decision that I, let's say in a new power way, that, I don't see myself as a national curator. I don't see myself as the one deciding about, the cultural programming of the institutions that we supervise at the Ministry of Culture, and that they have their own artistic independence, obviously. So that is, one thing. And the other thing is to try, and it goes to what you said, to educate the both society, but also like other policymakers across the aisle about the role of this sector. A way we've discovered that it works is that we talk to you speak their language. We are almost like a translator, an interpreter, So I can speak finance, I can speak, I can speak governance, I can speak all these languages, and that helps. And the other thing is to do projects together. So, for example, Ministry of Healthcare, Cultural Prescription, Ministry of Agriculture, raw materials for craft, Ministry of Education, programs in schools, Ministry of Digital Governance, immersive experiences, and so on and so forth. So that actually makes them understand that, this is not an obscure, sector of hobbyists and, trust fund babies, or of like people that are just crazy enough to do something that will never give them money. But it's something that is actually quite integrated both in everyday life as a consumption, but also in terms of the economy even, especially for a country like Greece,
Yeah.
Could we move to a situation where children can vote?
Well,
that's a longer discussion.
Yeah.
But an interesting one. I thank you so much, all of you, and especially to Henry for that really brilliant and brilliantly delivered proposition, and your equation around purpose and participation. And I just wonder from some of that conversation whether there's also another word that might go in there for our thinking in the best possible sense of kind of promiscuity. Like, you're talking to lots of different people and keeping that conversation open and alive.
I think it's worth avoiding in general.
Yeah, but you need
Very good to hear it.
You can do it while still keeping your clothes on, honestly.
In the best possible taste. But that, take your logo off, but be big and bold and fast with where you go. But it's a journey, and you are all incredibly invested in it, and thank you so much for your time. So I think it just remains for us to say some thank yous. Firstly, to our amazing translators. I don't know how many of you have been listening to them, but that's a very difficult task, and thank you so much. And then to the SNFCC team who've been doing the work behind this event, particularly Gabriela, Athena, and Sophia. And not least to our incredible panel, all of you. Ellie, particularly, for joining us on screen, which is never very easy, but thank you so much to Henry, to Stelios, and to Nicola. I hope you enjoy the rest of your birthday. And really good luck, all of you with
Get
taking...
off the stage now.
Yes. Go and do something else. Really good luck with taking the agenda forward, and thank you for the invitation to all of us to think and act in different ways. So to all of you, thank you so much. Efaristo and Kalinita.